These days, it seems like every church is using software for their worship keys rig. In this video, we'll go into how you can do that for your own church. We'll talk about the software that you need, the hardware, the MIDI gear, the audio gear. We'll help you get set up quickly with a software-based worship keys rig. Let's check it out. Hey folks, my name is David from SundaySounds.com, where our focus is making it easy for anybody to achieve great results in setting up a worship keys rig that is software-based. And that's actually the topic of today's video. We put out a new video on this topic every single week, so if you're a worship keys player or maybe the worship leader at your church, we hope that you'll subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because there's a new video every single week to help equip you and your worship team. Okay, today, so we're talking about the big picture idea of what we focus on here at Sunday Sounds. What are the big ideas and ingredients that you need to set up a successful worship keys rig that's based on software for your home church? We're gonna talk about this in basic terms that anybody can understand. So whether you've already got a keys rig and you wanna pick up some tips for how you can optimize it, or if you're maybe on the fence or just looking into this for the first time, this video is going to walk you through from point A to point Z, all the ingredients and considerations you need. And we're going to do this in a budget-friendly way as well, because for me, when I was first getting started with using software for the key sounds at my church, it was because I didn't have the budget that I would have needed to buy a brand new hardware keyboard. Software got me great worship sounds for a fraction of the cost, and that's what we're all about here at Sunday Sounds. So let's dive right in. So if you're new to this whole concept, you may have become familiar with the idea of using software for your keys rig because it seems like every music video or live recording video that you see from popular worship bands, you'll see a keyboard rig in the corner, probably tucked away on a platform, with a computer sitting next to the person playing keys. And I first started noticing this myself within the last decade, and now it seems like every single worship band video you see, there's a laptop or something sitting right next to the keys player. And so maybe you're asking, like, what is that all about? Why is every worship band that I follow doing this? And the answer is because it is an amazing option for getting great worship key sounds, and you get tons of added benefits, flexibility, extra control, customizability, and oftentimes for less budget than buying a brand new hardware keyboard. Plus, you get the added benefit of total flexibility. As long as there's a hardware keyboard wherever you're gonna go play, you can just throw your laptop computer in a backpack, a couple of cables, plug it in, and be ready to go in pretty much any context. So if you've decided that a worship keys rig that's based on software is the way that you want to go, let's talk about the ingredients that you need to find success. First off, you need a computer. Now, regardless of the software that you want to end up running, you're gonna want a powerful computer, or at least relatively powerful. Now, you don't have to spend $5,000 and buy a brand new Mac Pro to be able to get good results from your worship keys rig, but you want to make sure that you check the requirements of the software that you're planning to use. The two most popular softwares that we see folks using right now are MainStage 3 and Ableton Live. So you can learn more about those from the manufacturers of that software. Check the minimum system requirements. But we also recommend that you don't always just go with the bare minimum, because you want to make sure that your live rig is completely reliable. So don't skimp on the hardware. If you can afford to get a little bit of extra RAM, a better hard drive, maybe a faster processor, it's a really, really good investment. I would even say buy a cheaper MIDI controller, or don't buy that expensive plugin, and instead spend a little bit more money on the computer itself. It truly is the brain of your whole keys rig, so make sure it's up to the task of performing reliably. Now, secondly, and this is oftentimes where people can save a lot of money, if you have a computer that's already up to the task, you might think, well, I need to buy a new MIDI keyboard. But you probably don't. If your keyboard was built after 1985 or so, then there's a really, really high chance that you can actually use the keyboard that's already on stage at your church, or maybe it's tucked into the back of a closet or something, because pretty much all keyboards are doing the same simple thing. They're just sending numbers to your computer via a format called MIDI. MIDI is a type of data that was designed for synthesizers, designed to help keyboards communicate to each other originally back in the 80s and the 90s, and now it's how keyboards connect to software. It just sends a bunch of numbers that communicate what note you're playing, how loud you're playing it, when you stop playing it, all sorts of other stuff too, but it's just basic data. It's literally like a computer keyboard, but it's just sending notes instead of ASDXY. So it's really, really simple. And because of that, if you have a good feeling keyboard from the late 80s or the 90s, and it can connect and send MIDI data, then that might actually feel really, really good. And you might be good to go without buying any new hardware at all. The other side of this is that the MIDI keyboard market is now very, very competitive. So there's all sorts of affordable options for brand new MIDI hardware. You can get a pretty decent keyboard for as little as $200. And then of course, if you spend more money, then you can get lots of extra features, super premium feeling key beds, built-in audio interfaces, all sorts of functionality. So if you have the budget to spend on a brand new MIDI keyboard, you've got lots of options there. So if the computer is the brain of your keys rig and the controller's telling the brain what to do, the last big ingredient is figuring out how to get the sound from your computer to the soundboard. Now, if you're just getting started or testing the waters, if you're not even sure that you want to commit to this, the best place to start is just using the headphone jack on your computer, especially if you're just trying it out maybe at home or in the office in the middle of the week. Don't go out and buy an expensive audio interface if you don't already own one. Just plug a pair of headphones or buy a converter cable, plug it into the headphone jack and connect it to your soundboard. It's not a bad place to get started. Just make sure you turn on Do Not Disturb on your computer before you use it on Sunday. You don't want phone call or a text message coming in and the whole congregation being made aware of it. So don't necessarily feel like you have to buy an audio interface right out of the gate. Oftentimes the headphone jack can suffice for a little while. I will say over time, we strongly recommend investing a little bit of money in a dedicated audio interface. That's an external sound card that does the audio processing for your computer instead of the built-in sound card. And that audio interface will also include professional quality output jacks that you can directly connect to a direct box and then send the signal to your soundboard. You're gonna have a lower failure rate with an audio interface. Audio interfaces generally decrease the amount of delay between playing a note and hearing it, which is called latency. And depending on the audio interface you buy, you can have fewer issues with interference and maybe even increased audio quality versus the built-in headphone jack. Now, a lot of that's contingent on price, and we're not gonna get into a lot of that today because it's outside the scope of this video. So if you take anything away from this portion, headphone jack's not a bad place to start, and then an audio interface in the low to mid-tier price range is a great short to mid-term goal. Okay, so now that you've got your computer, your controller, and your audio stuff all figured out, it's time to figure out which software you want to use. Now, there's tons of softwares out there that you can use for your Worship Keys rig, but the two most popular by far are MainStage 3 and Ableton Live. And those two softwares are where we primarily focus our energy on here at Sunday Sounds. We create resources for both of these platforms because they're incredibly popular and they're both really powerful tools for churches that want to play great worship keys sounds. So there's all sorts of things to consider between those two platforms. There's differences in price, in functionality. Again, that's a little bit outside the scope of this video, but we will put links in the description to deep dives on both of those softwares where we lay out the strengths and weaknesses of both. So check out the links in the description if you'd like to see a little bit more about Ableton Live and MainStage 3, two specific options for your Worship Keys rig. Whichever software you decide, they're both really, really strong ones. So it's gonna impact a little bit of your workflow and how you choose to go about things, but you really can't go wrong. It's just making the best choice for you and the context of your specific worship team. After figuring out what software you're gonna run with, you need to learn how to use it. And not just you, if you're the worship leader at your church, you need to also make sure that you carve out some time to train your volunteers on how and why this software is going to be used. In my own personal experience, when I first discovered MainStage, I was a worship leader at my church, and I was really excited to give my volunteers some new resources to help them sound great. But the problem was I just assumed that they would understand and dive right in the way that I chose to do when I first discovered the software. The reality was actually quite the opposite. They got really overwhelmed, a little bit confused, pretty intimidated, and it was really sort of a turnoff to them for a while. They weren't really into the software. It wasn't until I realized that and took the time to sit down and explain what the software is designed to do, talk about the outcomes, the potential benefits, how they were going to be able to do more and add more to the worship team by learning to use this software. Once I invested time in the reasoning behind the software and set them up for a little bit more success, put some expectations in place, then they started to finally get why we were doing it. And from there, MainStage specifically, and then eventually Ableton Live became a staple part of the keys positions at the church that I was leading at that time. So make sure that if you're the worship leader, or maybe you're a part of the keys team and you're trying to help level up the other volunteers around you as well, make sure that you have those conversations. Don't just set up the laptop one rehearsal and expect them to just get it, to dive right in, because this is a new way of thinking. It's a new way of doing things. And because you're connecting things together, there are more possible points of failure than an all-in-one hardware keyboard. It's not likely to fail, especially if you take the proper precautions and learn how to set things up correctly. You just want to make sure that you're setting yourself and your worship team up for success. Now, one other thing in terms of MainStage and Ableton Live, both softwares have full plugin support. So if you know that you want to use third-party plugins from brands like Spectrasonics, maybe Omnisphere, Keyscape, stuff from Native Instruments like The Giant or Massive, you're going to be able to open all of those third-party plugins in both platforms. And here at Sunday Sounds, we also develop native patches for both platforms as well. So if you choose Ableton Live or MainStage, you're going to be able to get our Sunday Keys template in formats for both softwares, tons of song-specific patches, sound libraries designed for worship music. There's lots of resources out there for both platforms. So if you really know that you want to use Ableton Live, don't worry, you're going to have lots of options for finding great sounds. And the same is true if you choose MainStage. Okay, so you've got all of your choices made. You have your hardware, you have your computer, you have your software. Now let's just briefly talk about the setup steps. Let's say you're setting this up for the first time. We're gonna talk about this in general terms because regardless of the software or computer model you're using, we recommend you approach it in this way. First, you wanna get all of your hardware connected. We like to start with the MIDI keyboard because if you set up your audio gear first, you think that's all set up correctly, then you connect your keyboard, but you don't hear any sound. You don't know if it's a keyboard problem or an audio problem. So start with what's sending the input into the computer. So connect your MIDI keyboard to your computer. Now, depending on the keyboard that you're using, this might be possible directly over USB, or you might need a MIDI to USB converter cable, or you might choose to run a MIDI cable into an audio interface that can also handle MIDI data. Regardless, just make sure that you're familiar with the specific MIDI functionality of your keyboard. Especially older keyboards, not all of the knobs and faders will send MIDI data necessarily. Some keyboards might have specific modes that send MIDI and others that don't. A lot of newer MIDI keyboards are going to be plug and play. That's referred to in the manual probably as class compliant. So just make sure you look up the user manual for your keyboard online if you run into any trouble. Generally, a few minutes on Google, a couple pages in the user manual, and you're going to be able to get your keyboard connected to your computer. Once it's connected, how you set it up in software like MainStage or Ableton Live varies a little bit per software. In MainStage, if you have your keyboard connected to your computer and you play notes, even if it's not assigned to anything yet, you're going to see MIDI data in the top middle of the screen in the MIDI monitor area. If you see that, then you know it's connected, and then you just need to assign it to your on-screen keyboard. You do that in layout mode. We're not going to get into that more here, but if you need to Google that, just search connect a keyboard to MainStage. In Ableton Live, all of this actually happens in the preferences area of Ableton Live. There's a tab inside of preferences called MIDI, where you can view all of the MIDI devices that Ableton Live is aware of, and then you can tell Ableton Live what you want those MIDI devices to control. So there's more information available for MainStage and Ableton Live online. Again, just a couple minutes on Google and you're going to be able to connect your keyboards. Just make sure all your cables work, make sure you understand the terminology. Then once you've got your keyboard connected, just figure out how you want to get your audio out. So use the headphone jack. If you have an audio interface and you're having trouble getting it connected, one of the best things that you can do is actually take the audio interface out of the equation for a minute, grab any old pair of headphones, plug them into the computer, and make sure that it works through headphones. If it does, then you know you have an audio problem and not a MIDI problem. Otherwise, you can take hours and hours diagnosing what you think is an audio problem when in reality, the computer's just not being told to do anything because there's a MIDI problem that happens before audio is even generated. Once you've got MIDI going into your computer and audio coming out, then you have to figure out a workflow for how you're going to design or find the sounds that you're going to use for your worship team. There's all sorts of different ways to approach this. Some people like to make one go-to patch that they use for an entire worship set, maybe the patch for their church that has a really great pad, a really great piano, the sounds that they're always going to use. You can do that in MainStage, you can do that in Ableton Live, you can do that in any other software that you choose to use. Other folks like to design specific patches for specific songs or maybe specific styles. Some folks like to have a patch per part of a song, and they actually switch through multiple patches throughout the performance of a given song. It all depends on how much time you want to spend setting up and how comfortable you are moving through lots of arrangement changes during a live performance. I'd recommend that you try and strike a healthy balance between how much time you want to spend setting things up and then how much focus you want to be giving the performance aspects of what you're doing when you're on stage at your church. You want to make sure that you're not spending all of your energy tweaking knobs or hitting the next button when you really want to be focused on playing keys well and also engaging with the band, engaging with your congregation at church. So strike a healthy balance between setting things up front and then also being able to execute them without being too distracted during live performance. Okay, so we talked about the computer, we talked about a MIDI keyboard, we talked about choosing the right kind of software and how to make sure you know how to get audio out. And then we also talked about how to make sure you set your volunteers up for success, set clear expectations, figure out how much time you want to invest in this new initiative of setting up a software rig for keys at church. Last thing I want to say is if you need help with any of these specifics, because there's a lot of specifics, and each of these topics could have been its own video or maybe even a couple of videos. We're going to include some links in the description to help you suss these things out a little bit further. So we'll put some links to gear recommendations in the description. I think what we're going to do is we're actually going to take 3 different tiers of price points. So we'll have a very basic beginner keys rig, an intermediate budget rig, and then a higher end or sort of premium keys rig. So you can check out those 3 recommendations for gear links that might make the most sense for you. So you can pick a price point and view some recommendations for the gear that we know is going to get you good results. Because you don't have to spend tons of money to set up a worship keys rig, but there's some things that are also worth investing a little bit more money in upfront. I'll also include a link to our basics course, which is going to help you hit the ground running in your worship keys software. So if you need to be walked through every step of the way, even down to the specific hardware and software connections you need to make, then this free basics course is for you. So we'll put a link in the description to that as well. Lastly, we give away a new free worship patch every single week. If you'd like to download the back catalog of all of our free worship patches, there's over 170 free worship patches in there now. Then just click the link, sign up with your email address, and we'll send them your way. Thanks for watching.